Thank you everyone for dialing in today to this lightning lesson. My name is Ben, and I'm going to be hosting this session with a couple friends of mine who are um, really impressive people to me in this space. So I've been spending the last couple years really helping people get ready for meta style product sense and analytical thinking interviews primarily. I've done work with both Robert and Brian in the vein of helping people for those two interview types. And I think the number one thing that's been coming up for me that is like the biggest gap in everything that I'm doing these days is actually not product sense and analytical thinking related, but it's more about once people pass those interviews, they then have to get ready for the leadership and drive interview at Meta and at some other companies. They might not call it leadership and drive, but it's basically just getting buttoned up for behavioral interviews as product leaders. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized instead of trying to kind of do it all myself, I wanted to. Um, why is there someone whiteboarding? Okay, yeah, I don't know if everyone else just saw that, but well, we should not be whiteboarding on this right now. Feel free to kick back and just listen and enjoy the conversation. But yeah, I'd say Robert and Brian are two people I really respect when it comes to getting ready for the behavioral interviews that are used at places like Meta, the leadership and drive interview. So we wanted to take this session today to go deep on that. So before I let Brian and Robert introduce themselves, we're not gonna spend too much time looking at slides during this session, but I just want to have a few slides to start with some housekeeping. So Brian or Robert, can you give me a thumbs up if you see these slides? Great. So some housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded and emailed to everyone who RSVPs after the fact. If you know someone who would benefit from this that didn't even know about this, so they didn't RSVP, they can always sign up later. You can just share the recording link that you get over email, and they can put in their email, and they'll get the recording email to them as well. So that's actually how a lot of people get this content. They don't necessarily have to be here live. Same applies if you just have to drop at some point. Life happens, work happens, so don't feel like you'll miss out. You'll just get the recording later. If you want, you can turn off your video during the session. At the end, we'll do some Q&A, but even that's going to be primarily chat-based, so there really won't be a need for people to share your video on this, so no pressure at all to do that. And then this will go by pretty quickly, so if you miss something, again, like recording is going to help a lot. And I think you're all muted by default. So if it's all the same to you, please just stay muted so that the recording quality doesn't get interfered with in any way. And then please hold questions until the end and use the chat for that. If you drop questions in as we go, it will most likely get ignored because I'll be kind of like facilitating the panel until we get to the end. So if you've got questions, I know you're probably really antsy and excited to drop them. I've been there. Just like wait until the end. You'll have a chance to ask them. I also noticed, having hosted probably half a dozen of these lightning lessons at this point, people have a tendency to plug their like their LinkedIn's and like there's some like a promotional element to like what people do in the chat. I would really ask that you don't do that, please. So just kind of keep the chat clean so that when we get to the Q&As, there's not a lot of noise to sift through. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Hey Ben, I noticed one of the participants is also recording the talk, and I'll defer to you, Ben, of course, but I understand you're recording it and there'll be some edits based on what you record. So I think I would prefer it to only be recorded by you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't see that. Where are you seeing this, Brian?
In the chat, it says, this is an automated message to let you know that my tactic extension is transcribing this meeting so I can give my full attention to you.
Yeah, I guess that these days that's almost inevitable with things like granola. So I think as long as they're not transcribing like the video or recording the video, there's actually nothing I can do about that other than boot them. Um, so I'll probably have to let that slide, Brian. I don't know if there's anything I can do about that one.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
No
but
worries.
Tony, feel free to disable that if you if you want and can.
We just won't say anything mean about bots that might offend it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when
sorry about that. I didn't even know that it was turned on by default. I'll try to disable it.
Cool. Thank you for that. These days, best practice for people, I would say use like one of the quieter ones that doesn't make itself known and it just avoids awkward conversations. But that's a separate opinion. Okay, so with all that said, let's keep going. So today we're going to cover how real calibrated interviewers evaluate the notoriously ambiguous leadership and drive interview at Meta. If any of you are getting ready for it, you might know what I mean. There's a bunch of materials out there. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly what they're looking for and how this interview plays out. So hopefully this will help with that. You'll get a feel for what great sounds like across the key dimensions that are being evaluated in the leadership and drive interview. So things like resourcefulness, growth mindset, ownership, conflict resolution, and ultimately some tips on how to best prepare in practice for these interviews. So we'll start with some intros. We'll have a panel. That should get us to probably like the 45-minute mark. If people need to drop, like I said, you can watch the Q&A after the fact. So with that said, I think I've mostly done my intro before I've been teaching this course that I teach on Maven and do a lot of the coaching work I do now. I spent time at various early stage startups as the head of product at a Series A company called Continuum, spent some time at Attentive, which is a leader in marketing tech. Before that, I was at Meta for a couple of years working on guidance for small business advertisers. And then before that, a series of earlier stage startups, some of which worked, some of which didn't. But yeah, that's kind of a bit about me. And then Robert, would you like to go next and share a bit more about your background?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I'm Robert Hamilton. I'm a full-time coach, mostly working with PMs, but I also have a few clients who are engineers and people who work in strategy. I started coaching in 2020. Prior to that, I was at Meta. Meta, I worked on VR when it was still called Oculus, and I was also PM for Spam at Meta for just under a year when I started. Prior to that, it was a startup. Before that, it was at Google. Long time at Google, 8 years. I worked on mobile search. I created the Google Search app, the one that's on iOS and also the one that's on Android. In fact, I created them before Android and iOS existed on other platforms, but most of you are probably too young to remember those. I worked on Gmail, and then I was a PM on the Android team, leading all the Android apps. And my last role at Google was working on Nexus devices. So again, for those newer to the business, Nexus was around before Pixel. It was how Google partnered with OEMs. So I spent a little bit of time as a hardware PM, and that's where most of my gray hair came from.
Thanks, Robert. Brian, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hey, so I'm Brian Kemmler. I'm a product lead currently at DoorDash. I have about a decade and a half of product management experience at DoorDash, at Google, as well as at Meta. I got my start launching 0 to 1 products in underserved markets like Thailand and Burma for big Google products like Gmail, Google News, and Search. I've also worked on self-driving cars, early privacy preserving technology. And that I worked on privacy and accessibility. And so I've kind of morphed into a trust and safety PM. I think the one through line in my career has been I've been using a lot of AI since well more than 10 years ago, and AI has been that kind of continuous streak through the work that I do. And so now it's like super exciting to see how AI has come to the fore in terms of how we build as product builders.
Awesome. Thanks, both of you. And for just to kind of set some context for the group on how we all have kind of interplayed into each other. Brian and I actually met when Brian joined Meta. I was his assigned, I guess, onboarding buddy at Meta. And even though I think he came at it a level more senior than me, I think I kind of helped him just navigate the culture there. And he stayed longer than I did. I think a little over 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, Brian, and grew there really nicely after having an incredible run at Google for 10 plus years. So Brian and I have just like stayed close. And in addition to being an incredible kind of like big tech PM that Brian is, he's also been doing a lot of work to help candidates get ready for interviews. He has some interview coaching materials and guides and has a Substack that he has. So we'll plug those at the end. But Brian is someone who's also been joining the office hours in my course for the last, I think, like 6-7 months or so this year. So my students are well familiarized with Brian and have given me like tremendous feedback about how helpful his thoughts have been to them and their interview prep. And then Robert, we've met through a community called Supra, community for product leaders. And Robert pinged me one day. He's like, "Hey, like I think I have a lot of thoughts on leadership and drive interviews and behavioral interviews, would love to come on your podcast. So he came to the Super Insider podcast that I host and did an incredible episode. So if you end up wanting to hear more from Robert too, I would highly encourage you to check out that episode of my podcast, Super Insider, episode 60, I believe, that Robert joined us for. Okay, without more intros. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now because you're like, wait, we're already at Q&A? What's going on here? So the way this is going to work is we're going to cover the three main topics that I mentioned, and we're going to keep it conversational. I think actually the way to do this is I'm supposed to spotlight the three of us so that we stay front and center. So let me just do that. Okay. So I think now Robert, Brian, and I should all be the main view. And I'm going to mostly be facilitating a discussion here, and they'll be sharing thoughts. So I think where I want to start maybe is with Robert. And Robert, I want to pose a question for you just to kind of get us all in the same headspace, which is in Meta, like the three primary interviews that they use, at least for most product managers, as you get to like senior leadership, there's additional kinds of ones. But for most people that interview at Meta, they'll run into three types: product sense, analytical thinking, and leadership and drive. What makes the leadership and drive interview different in your view relative to the other ones? Like, what are the things that you think Meta is really trying to suss out in this interview?
Great question. I think it's because it's it's real life case based, right? The other topics are really all hypotheticals. So they are about bringing your intellect to solve a problem, whether that's in product sense or analytical thinking. Whereas leadership and drive is really all about how you show up as a PM and as a PM leader. So it is personal. It's not hypothetical. It's about real things. You know, very early on, people learn, you know, if you get asked, tell me about a time you resolved conflict. If you go into here's my framework for resolving conflict, that's terrible, right? It's like, no, I want to hear about a real instance. We can all read a management textbook. We can all, you know, we all know the classic playbook for conflict resolution, but when have you actually done it? So it is not really about a test of your problem solving skills where you're given a situation and asked to dive into it and to come up with ideas and solutions. It's really about you relating how you show up as a PM, and we'll talk more as we get into some of the detail about how to do that well. But it's not what have you worked on. That's the other key thing. It's like if you end up explaining your projects in great detail and like, you know, the technical problems that you solved, you're not going to do well in leadership and drive. It is really about how you show up and the people and the organizational aspects of PMing, rather than, you know, solving a hard technical problem or you know, doing amazing user discovery. We care a lot less about those things than, and as I say, I'll keep using the term how you show up. I'm sure Brian has good perspectives on this too.
Yeah, and Brian, before you go, just to kind of like check in. So I think what I'm hearing from you, Robert, is like, as you think about the product sense interview, which is largely about your ability to take a very ambiguous prompt, like how would you improve, you know, a certain product, or how would you build Google, you know, a parking solution for Google Maps, or these, which allow you to demonstrate like the skills of setting a mission statement for a product and explaining the rationale, the strategic rationale for it, and then doing segmentation and picking like problems for a chosen segment, and then coming through solutions, and then picking, like narrowing in on a V1, which is very like product sense skills related. And then the analytical interview, which is all about your ability to measure success and kind of like gauge the health of an ecosystem through metrics. The mutual exclusive, the signals that Meta is looking for in these interviews is mutually exclusive. So what's remaining after trying to evaluate those two interviews is basically, how does this person show up as a leader? How do they motivate people? How do they deal with kind of like the personal side of this job, not like the hard skills or like
Absolutely.
that part of the job.
And that mutually exclusive way, I think, is a great way for folks to think of it. If you find yourself doing product design or talking about the sort of analytical thinking topics in leadership and drive, stop, because they are mutually exclusive. That's a really great way to think of it. And that applies to the other two as well, actually. So that's a really good framing, Ben. That's definitely how the Venn diagram looks. There's kind of no overlap.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And just like
I think I stole that from you, actually, if I'm not mistaken. I think you kind of helped me find the words for the mutual exclusive signal. So maybe you get the credit there.
Robert would be.
No, Brian, I think you planted the mute because that's different than Google. We talked about how at Google there's some
Totally.
overlap in the signals that they look for in these interviews. Where at Meta, it's almost like every interview is kind of looking for a very concrete set of signals that is not being evaluated in the other interviews.
That's exactly correct. So yeah, so I think, look, in a nutshell, like I totally agree with all the feedback that Robert just shared and what you said, Ben, as well. At the end of the day, leadership and drive interview, it's a retrospective behavioral interview. Inherently, it's subjective, right? So this is not about the quantitative, the methodical of analytical thinking or product sense, which isn't to say it doesn't have a methodical part of it, because these answers have to be structured, they have to be rigorous, just like the PS or AT interviews. But as a behavioral retrospective interview, this is your chance to shine based on past performance being maybe not completely, but reliable indicator of future results, right? So they want to see how you express your leadership abilities during times of duress. And times of duress are like anytime you're shipping a product, there is conflict between teams, conflict between individuals, conflict between rank and file and management, and leadership and drive, keyword being leadership. You are expected as an APM, as an L4 or ICPM, to be a leader. You are expected to lead the team and model behavior. And those are the signals that Meta is really super diving into and drilling down on.
Yeah, awesome, great. So let's double click into what those actual areas are, which is, I think, the second kind of part of what we want to cover in this lesson now that we have a foundation. So as we think about, and this is not like proprietary, like Meta has a publicly available PM interview guide that everyone can just go to their website and find. But the key dimensions that I think Meta is looking to evaluate in the leadership and drive interview fall into 4 primary buckets. The first one is resourcefulness and results. Which is all about, can a candidate really deliver results when things go off the rails or when they're lacking resources? And can they get on the scoreboard in a certain way? The second bucket is seeking growth and learning, which is, does a candidate seek feedback and learn from their mistakes, or do things just like happen to them and they keep going without changing anything about how they operate in the world? The third bucket is around taking ownership and accountability. So does this person actually step up and lead without, really being told? And do they take responsibility for what happens and learn from it? And then the last major bucket, the fourth one, is really around conflict resolution and team collaboration, and how this person builds trust, navigates conflict, aligns with stakeholders. So those are the 4 main buckets. And I'd love to go kind of maybe one by one with the two of you and hear a bit more about what are the kinds of things that, as you reflect on your experience as interviewers and maybe even as coaches for people, when you're like, wow, that's like a really good answer. What are the kinds of things? I know we're not going to have time to get into specific stories in this format, but what are the kinds of things that stand out along each of those dimensions that you feel like make a very strong response? And maybe, Brian, we could maybe start with you this time. But as you think about maybe that first bucket, the resourcefulness bucket, I'm curious what kind of stands out to you there.
Yeah, so I think this is all about exhibiting attributes of the company's values. And one of the company's values is scrappiness, right? And so can you deliver results in the face of setbacks, in the face of surprises, and how do you lead the team through that? And so I think this has a number of sub-components. So one is, like, can you foresee and anticipate the things that can go awry when you're building products and features, right? If those things are outside of your immediate circle of control, even if they're a second or tertiary circle of control, do you take responsibility and ownership over them, or just kind of throw up your hands and say, oh, well, there was a dependency on this framework team. They didn't deliver the API. So like we had to slip our thing out. Or are you the kind of PM that like builds and establishes that relationship with a PM, anticipates things in advance. When you get some early signal that things are going sideways or could be delayed, are you able effectively to go in there in a proactive way, get your hands dirty, influence that team, and get the thing done, all while balancing the needs and requirements of both your team and whatever team you have a dependency on. Lastly, I think this is, largely about operating in a realm where there's a lot of ambiguity, and one needs to demonstrate, bringing clarity to that ambiguity, being resourceful and again scrappy in terms of like making assumptions and delivering things anyway, even if it's not perfect or even if you do not have the clearest guidance.
I appreciate that, Brian. Robert, anything you would add to that you think people should
Yeah,
know
I think
about that part of the interview?
I think a lot of it is about being able to ruthlessly prioritize. There is a saying at Meta that if it doesn't hurt, it's not prioritization. That like you really do need to be focused on the right thing. It's like if you can't do both, which one is most important? And really knowing that, and making sure that your team is focused on the right goals is part of driving results. And I think on the resourcefulness side, there's lots of kind of analogies about what role the PM plays. And I think the one that Meta probably leans closest to is the conductor analogy, that like conducting an orchestra. But I would also say that at Meta and at lots of places that are scrappy, sometimes you have to step in and play the instrument yourself. And being that like kind of, oh, I don't have a data scientist. Oh, I don't have a UX. I can't get a UX researcher to go and find out about this. As a PM, again, building on Brian's point, if you just hold up your hands and say, so no user research for us, like, well, no, find a way, do it yourself, borrow an expert from another team, whatever it happens to be, but just keep your team moving forward. And that kind of scrappiness is at the heart of it. That's like, if you need something, then, do whatever you can. Don't, and keep moving, don't wait. I think that's the other thing. And adding to Brian's point, I think, all the way through this, probably one of the worst things you can do in L&D is to blame somebody. That's like, oh, leadership didn't support us. Oh, the other team had the wrong priorities. Any of those things. It's like, well, if you needed the other team's priorities to change, why didn't you go in and change it? You failed to get leadership support. Is it if it's like leadership didn't support my idea, well, that's on you, right? It's not that leaders decided badly. If you had the right idea, you should have driven it. So again, I think, we'll talk more about this in ownership, but I think that anywhere where I see someone blaming, where it's like, my eng lead wasn't proactive. It's not to say you can't criticize people, but or to point out their weaknesses, but you should be doing something about it. And I think that's also part of resourcefulness. If my eng lead isn't hugely collaborative, I've got to help them become collaborative. Again, that's part of resourcefulness, is like piling in to do whatever. So yes, be the conductor, but know that sometimes you got to run down into the orchestra pit and actually pick up the instrument and play. You won't play it as well as an expert, but it'll get played, and that's kind of what matters in these situations. It's not necessarily my favorite analogy of what a PM does, but I think it's the one that resonates with Meta. Brian, I think Naomi, who is one of the like PM elders, I think that was her preferred. And Ben, you probably remember Naomi talking about the kind of conductor model.
Yeah. There's all kinds of different, I think, analogies I've heard people use internally for like how they see the role of the PM there. But I think that conductor one, and it's a culture of influence, right? So it's like the ability to get people to do what you want them to do by convincing them that it's in their best interest versus because you have like explicit authority over them. And then this is a good moment as we kind of transition maybe to the second dimension that candidates are being evaluated on, to kind of plug something that I think every candidate should know, which is that, when you think about product sense interviews, there's kind of like a big question that you get asked, and the whole interview flows from there. Analytical thinking interviews might have like a main question with some clarifying questions followed by a trade-off question at some point in the interview. As you think about leadership and drive interviews, you could have an interviewer start an interview with one question and not really knowing what the other questions are going to be. And Robert, I think this was kind of more of the bucket that you fell into as an interviewer. Is I'm going to ask you one big question and kind of follow my curiosity to get as much signal as I need across these various dimensions that we're going to get into from one trailhead per se in that conversation. And then Brian, I think you might fall into the second bucket of interviewers that maybe you actually did have kind of like more explicit questions that you liked to ask or you like to ask that allow you to get the signal on each of these dimensions. Would you guys both agree that that's a fair characterization of your strategies as interviewers?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. And I think that's helpful for candidates because sometimes they just don't know like if all the interviewers show up the same exact way or if there's some variability. So I want them to be prepared for both. Okay, so now let's get into the second dimension that is all around like seeking growth and learning opportunities. So I forget which one of you went first on the last dimension, but let's rotate it. Yeah, what stands out to you about this dimension, Brian? Brian, you went first, or Robert went first?
I went first on the last one, so I was
okay. So Robert, you can go
okay.
first. Yeah.
Sure.
And Robert, please touch on your modification to the STAR framework because I think that's probably very largely related to this
sure.
growth and learning dimension.
Am I that predictable? No, that's a good thing to add, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, the opportunities to grow and learn. Again, this is in leadership and drive, right? So we're looking for learning, probably not technical learning. Oh, I learned about building evals. Yeah, great. You should, as a PM, be learning new technical things all the time. But this is learning about yourself, learning about your weaknesses, your areas for growth, figuring out how you PM, where the gaps are, and really demonstrating that you want to fill those gaps. So, you pretty much always get a question, the intent of which is, what are you working on right now? And it is not, oh, I'm building, a new bot to do this, or it's like, what are you working on you? Which aspect of PMing are you trying to improve? And I kind of call everything else technical. There's like behavioral learning and there's technical learning. Behavioral stuff is about yourself. And we're always looking for people who are very reflective, that they reflect on both failure and success. Something we talked about on the Super podcast, I think, Ben, was that sometimes when people get a question like, what's the project you're most proud of? They kind of forget to reflect because it's like, oh, we did this and it was great. And Meta does ask a lot of kind of probing, kind of not negative questions, but, when did you struggle to support your team effectively? Or when weren't you able to get leadership support? Because a lot of learning comes from those tough situations where things are difficult, when things aren't going well for us. So do be aware if you get asked, what's been your biggest success as a PM? Make sure you still bring in some reflection that it's like, yeah, we shipped and it was amazing and we got lots of users or we drove lots of revenue, but I can't help feeling I could have helped the team to focus better. Or if I'd learned more about users before we started, we could have shipped sooner by having more focus, or whatever it happens to be. And the STAR framework, which most people know, situation, task, action, and results. I like to add an L and a U, which means it's not quite so nice an acronym, but the L is for learning. That's what did you learn through that process? Again, not really a technical learning. I learned that people's past experience will impact their judgment. If they are new to something, they might be afraid, or they might be worried, about their ability to handle it for the first time. Other people may be jaded because they've done something so many times, so that might be, a learning from a situation. It's a learning about people and learning about how people behave and how people engage. And then the upgrade, particularly for senior leaders, is the most important piece. So it's like, what did I learn? The upgrade is, how have I changed the way I behave to bake in that learning? Because I don't know about other folks on the call, I learn something pretty much every day. My ability to wrap that into my behavior is definitely imperfect, right? There's things I learn and then a week later I'm like, hang on, I already learned that. Why did I make the same mistake? So the upgrade is to say, so now when I join a new team, I like to look at all of the individuals, figure out where they've come from, what their biases might be, what their strengths and weaknesses are, so that I don't get caught out later on. So that's that idea of like, and the reason I use the word upgrade, think of it like upgrading an operating system. It's like we've patched that bug. I won't make that mistake again. And the learning that I had from that situation, it now carries with me and it changes the way I behave. And if you can, you don't have to bring those things in unprompted. You know, lots of interviewers will say, "What did you learn through that process?" But if you can bring them in unprompted and talk about that, and don't feel you have to save learning for the end. That's also a common thing. You know, sometimes if you're talking about the 6-month or a year project, you probably learn things along the way. You don't have to wait until kind of the project's launched and then say, "Oh, I learned about stakeholder management early on." Talk about it when it feels natural, and also before we hear from Brian, I would say that about being natural. Don't copy the way other people do L&D answers. Like, don't be a robot. Like, be you. Talk about things the way you talk about them, and that's where, you know, just being natural across the piece, not. And again, in the reflection, you know, some of the best L&D interviews, I've had people, you know, really kind of feeling like, "Oh yeah, that was really tough," and their sense of frustration comes across. That's a great thing. If you see someone who's really frustrated, you know, "I'm struggling to get the best out of my team, and I tried this and I tried that," like, I would much rather see that than see someone who's really polished, and much rather see that sense of kind of struggle. But yeah, the learning and the upgrade stuff, you can bring that in organically. Most interviewers will prod you towards it, but either way is fine. You don't have to bring it, but if you can, then do.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Brian. I'd love to hear what you have to add.
Sure. So I think I like if I could title this so everybody like sort of really understands like succinctly and concretely what growing continuously means, I would title this growth and feedback in a 2x2 grid where there is growth for self and growth for others, and feedback for self and feedback for others. So a lot of this is they are looking for signal on, you know, not just like, "Hey, I'm Brian, I'm committed to my craft of being a PM," to Robert's point of getting better at being a PM, but as like, "Hey, when did Brian get hard feedback? How did Brian take that hard feedback, assimilate it, and like really use that difficult feedback, that failure, that launch that went awry, and assimilate that into his persona as a PM so that that would never happen again," right? So that's the first piece. That's the self piece. The second piece, the other piece, I think there's two dimensions, but this is the most concrete part of it is like, okay, now that I have learned that lesson, how have I proactively helped, taught, coached, advised, and or given hard feedback to other people on the team, not just product to eng, design, anybody, XFN. How do I approach that process and methodology of that feedback to support other people's growth and the team's health, company's health, the success of the user? So I think that is really the signal that they're going for here.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing across both of these is that there's kind of like minimum bar that some people might have for what they think sounds like a good story that ends with, you know, like the action kind of reaching a certain conclusion. But Meta in particular is just so maniacally focused on finding people who can really go that next level of like how they internalize like what they learned. And Brian, to your point, like if you learn something so deeply that you found yourself then giving someone else feedback about it, and you talked about how it helped them upgrade their behavior, like that's, I think, kind of like a home run story as far as like really internalizing some of these learnings. So I love that. And I want people to shoot for the moon with their stories. Like, don't hold back. And Robert, you have something you like to kind of share, or something that stuck with me, which is like, you know, the story. The story almost always has another chapter. If it ends with like a failure, there's like another chapter to that story, which is about the success that follows the failure, and just making sure you remember to kind of land that plane with the end of the story. Okay, now getting into the third dimension. So we've talked about resourcefulness and results and scrappiness. We've talked about seeking growth and kind of like demonstrating how you've internalized learnings from experiences and mistakes and failures to level up and upgrade your behavior. And then the third dimension here is around really taking ownership and accountability. So how does this one feel different to you guys as you think about the signal you're looking for as interviewers and for those first two dimensions? What feels different about this one?
You want to dive in, Brian?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. Sounds good. So like on this one, I think it's embodied in the adage, I as a PM take all of the blame and none of the credit. Now that's different in an interview. In an interview, you want to take all of the credit, and you can take some of the blame. But in the day-to-day job as a practitioner of the craft of PM, you are really supporting the team. And if something goes wrong, the bottom line is upon you as a PM. And so these, so like think when you're crafting your stories, think about those situations where something went awry, and it wasn't that you blamed engineering or design or XFN or some exogenous factor, but like you take responsibility for everything. So I think that's the first, that's the first piece. And then I think the second piece is like really a commitment to user, company, team, and probably in that order. I think, if you look on Meta's external stuff, it's like they have Meta, MetaMates, and me, something like that. I always add user on top of that. That's my addition, because I think like user is the highest value, company second, team third, and just displaying that commitment and that through line from that user through the needs of the company and down into the like operational aspects of the team, and getting the work done, and then embodying and exemplifying that commitment to the goals and objectives and the work.
Love that. Thanks for sharing, Brian. Robert, would love to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, I think there's part that I would add on to that, which is very much about as part of the ownership piece. You've got to really know your charter and know what you are responsible for owning, and don't be afraid to intentionally expand it. So it's like my team could, if we owned that, we could have more impact. And as I was thinking about this call, it's like there are certain trigger words for Meta. Anyone who's sat in a PSC meeting, and impact is one of those trigger words. If you sprinkle the word impact in your interview, it's like, oh, I wanted to make sure we had the most impact. Anyone who's ever been in a PSC review will be like, oh, great, you've focused on the right thing. But if you think, oh, I realized that if we took on this extra project, we could increase our impact. It's like that ownership of, like, extreme ownership of what you already own, but not being afraid to say, we should also have that. Maybe no one owns it right now. Maybe someone else owns it and you feel you could do a better job, but not having a fixed mindset, which is, well, I was given this list of things that I own, and that's it. I'm going to stay in my lane and not adapt, because Meta changes all the time. Like there's things, its ability to adapt is probably its greatest strength, and to adapt quickly. Not to say it doesn't make mistakes, but that's, if you adapt quickly, making mistakes is less important, because you can make the mistake and then undo it and move in a different direction. So I would say that, again, ownership and accountability. It's like, if you think you should own something, and this is something I saw a lot of Meta, is like, people, you should go and grab it and demonstrate impact through that. And Brian's point is spot on about taking the blame. It's like, you may not be responsible for a thing that went wrong, but you should be responsible for fixing it and finding a way around it. And that's a big part of this.
I was going to save this for Q&A, but we're already on it, and I think I'm just curious. Like, do you guys think there's such a thing as taking too much blame or taking too much responsibility for a failure in an interview setting, at least?
I think this is the delicate balance of the behavioral interview, right? So let's say, there's some sort of scenario. I'm waiting for a team to release an API, like their engineer gets hit by a bus. Like, am I responsible for that engineer dying? No. but I am responsible for thinking through the things that could go wrong, having a plan to anticipate them, and like where risk is medium or high, having a plan B, if not already anticipated, then certainly on tap. And like I do look at myself as a PM as the overall responsibility for the success of the product or the feature, the timeline, the delivery, like all of those things. That is like 100% on me, even if that person has gotten hit by the bus. Like I think you don't want to throw yourself under the bus too much here, especially if it's a situation where you maybe did make an obvious or unforced error, mistake, that type of thing. And so these are all about finding that balance of being able to introspect genuinely, but like if you had some like glaring, horrible thing that you did that was like totally opposite, I don't think I would use that for one of these questions. I would pick something that is like a little, not vanilla and generic, but something maybe a little less blatantly incorrect.
Yeah, and I think, a common follow-up question I use is, if you were faced with a similar situation again, what might you do differently? And it is okay to say, actually, I think that went pretty well. I would probably pretty much do the same thing. If you say that every single time, it's bad. But it is okay to be good at your job. You can have a successful launch where you acted well. You should have already had some reflection about maybe I could have, but there are times, to Brian's point, when things go well and it's okay. You don't always have to be kind of digging in the muck. But it's okay to say, actually, I think that went pretty well, and I probably wouldn't change anything. Don't artificially create something just for the sake of answering that question, but don't always push back on that. There should be times when you think, oh, I could have acted sooner, or I could have spent more time building that relationship, or whatever it happens to be. But you definitely can take too much blame. And taking blame without introspection, which was, I think, a key part of what Brian said. It's like just saying it's all on me. Well, if you don't learn from it, then there's no value in you taking the blame. It's like the blame is a phase you go through in order to get the learning. It's like, what could I have done? Hey, maybe this is on me. What could I have done differently? That's what you use the blame for. It should be part of your process, but it's not the focus of your answer. It's like, how did I improve as a PM through this tough situation? And sometimes taking the blame and thinking, was it me? What could I have done differently? Is part of doing that work on your process.
Yeah, I love. Thanks for exploring that kind of double click, because I think, to summarize what I just heard, is that you don't want to share an example. Brian, I think what was coming to mind is you don't want to share an example or a story that sounds like sheer incompetence of some kind. Like there's like a core
Yes, do not.
aspect of
the bar is definitely higher than incompetence.
Yeah, like, so you obviously don't want to go, like, if you actually, that's like below the bar of where we want to be with our failure stories, because that leaves a doubt in the mind of the interviewer that there's bigger issues as a PM. But so finding that kind of story that you learn from, I think, is the key, rather than something that's like fundamentally like, I did the best with what I knew at the time, and if I had this information, here's what I would have done differently, is kind of like somewhat of a recipe for what great sounds like.
And I think it's okay to reference emotions. Like one of my stories is we were down a user experience researcher. I led the user experience research expedition. I always fashioned myself as an excellent writer and an excellent communicator. And basically the feedback I got on my deck was that it wasn't structured enough and I needed to do a redo. And like, I took that as kind of I took it as kind of an ego hit, but I took a breath. I took a breath. I assimilated the feedback. I went back. I reworked the deck, and then I went around to the stakeholders and got like feedback on the deck again. And they said, "Hey, the deck was like amazing. The second was amazing. And so I think like it's okay to reference like, hey, like I took it as a little bit of a blow. Like that shows that you're human. Nobody expects you not to be human. You are human, but like that you're not acting, oh yeah, like I pushed back. I said, this is ridiculous. I'm a great no. So it's like it's all about finding that balance and being authentic.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, now just because I'm keeping my eye on the clock, but I think this is great. So I want us to cover the fourth dimension, then we'll have some more time for maybe a question or two. So we've talked about the first three. The final dimension is really about conflict resolution and team collaboration. And so conflict is really triggering for a lot of people. So my question, like when you think about, sorry to use, brute language, but like when people think of an asshole that they worked with who was like just like unpleasant, or like someone who just like steamrolled them, or like a manager that was really toxic, right? Like those are the types of conflict that can come to mind for people. So I'm just curious, like when you think about strong answers from candidates, what are there any like themes for the kinds of conflict stories that you think lend themselves really well to these kind of interviews and the way they get presented?
I feel that things that rumble on are much more powerful than things that are like a quick spike of conflict where you kind of go in and you know like almost anything that gets resolved in a day or two. I'm like, really, was that a conflict or just a difference of opinion? That was like, I got the people in a room, we talked it through, they agreed. Like that's not a conflict. That's kindergarten conflict. It's not it's not significant, and it also needs to be something which is material. Like it has to be impacting a problem. I would also say that not part of it is seeing that people are not afraid of conflict, and even I would say at higher levels of creating conflict where necessary, because sometimes it is important to like push back and to handle that. And I don't think there are that many questions about that. Usually it is about resolution, but you do have to have a healthy relationship with conflict, and part of that is being able to not just avoid it. It's like, conflict avoidance is like avoiding fixing other people's conflicts, but also perhaps not stepping in, not pushing back and not generating conflict. And again, focus on the behavior. I had a client I was working with who, in their L&D at Meta, this is before they worked with me, I should add as a caveat, they started explaining the story, and they were working for one of the rideshare companies, and their conflict was about a conflict between the two sides of the business around tipping, drivers and riders having a different perspective. And the Meta interviewer, after 2 minutes, stopped them in their tracks and said, I am not interested in how tipping works on your platform. I want to understand the conflict with the other person. So they were like, it's not about tipping. It's about your relationship with the other person. And that interviewer, I think, did that candidate a huge favor by doing that. And I just wanted to share that today as an example of like, don't over explain the conflict, explain the behaviors, because there's always differences of opinion. Brian, I'm sure you have thoughts on that kind of, is the matter at hand the conflict, or is the conflict the
Like
thing?
the people problem, like
Yeah.
the drama between the humans. Yeah, I'm curious what you think, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's an opportunity to, and I totally agree with Robert's points, I think if there is an opportunity to tie the conflict to the impact for user, company, team, that is like really important, especially when if you're using Star, you get to the end and you talk about the results, right? So is conflict is okay. And compare and contrast, like Google was, I'll just be candid, Google was slightly more conflict avoidant than Meta. And Meta was more embracing of conflict, but primarily and overwhelmingly, I would say in an absolutely healthy kind of way where it was like pretty simple and straightforward to be like, okay, Ben's the monetization PM, Brian's the privacy PM. Like even before we get into that, the room like we understand a little bit about each other's perspectives and worlds, and that like for Brian to get his whole thing, Ben's gonna have to lose his whole, like lose some of his, and vice versa, that there's like an inherent trade-off between privacy and monetization, right? And so it is okay to go into that room and have that conversation, suss that out, and then agree on that like escalation path forward, right? So what they are looking for is that, you know, you're an adult, you're mature, you're not bringing in like emotions, and you're focused on like data, and that like the two stakeholders in this, like say trade-off situation, can, you know, level up to you know, a higher value, be it, like I said, at the company, the user level or whatnot.
Got it. So great stories here, like are not about the details about the specific, you know, PRD level disagreement about what the right solution is, but it's these kind of longer standing, these things that have like a deeper kind of way that they're impacting people psychologically, perhaps, or like the behaviors, but there's maybe like the ability to diagnose as an adult what the maybe incentive structures are that are causing the conflict to happen, and maybe demonstrating like initiative in the process of calling that out, leveling with the other person, identifying the mismatch, and if maybe like incentive structures need to get rearranged or revisited so to align people so they could work together collaboratively, in a healthy way. Like that's basically like one way to tell a story about resolving conflict.
Yeah, or just leveling it up to like figuring out what the common denominator, common ground is.
Yep. Cool. That's actually a perfect tee up for my first, you know, Q&A question here, which is, I'm probably not the only one that's kind of hearing you guys talk through these and saying like, hey, like this sounds like there's some overlap between the kinds of stories that can demonstrate like resourcefulness and like focusing on results and like learning and growing and taking ownership and accountability and resolving conflict. And especially if I'm tying the conflict resolution to like, you know, ownership and, you know, resourcefulness and like results. So like I'm curious to get your guys' take, like um do you think that candidates, when they're getting ready for these interviews, which is like our last kind of part of this session, do you think when candidates are getting ready, they should prioritize kind of like preparing and practicing and just like reflecting on stories that almost like allow them to check as many of the boxes that we've talked about as possible, because they'll have the most kind of things to talk about without having to like context switch in the interview?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I feel pretty strongly, and I have a very distinct preparation style that I think works for me and how my brain works cognitively. But what I do is I try to load in these stories prior to the interview, so they are in like random access memory that I could just get them instantly, rather than be sitting there in an interview. Um, Trying to get the mental backup tapes off the back of the truck and onto the loading dock and into my brain. Because if I'm doing that, that's going to take a lot of time. And these are very nuanced scenarios where emotions and feelings and subjectivity come in. And I really want to be thoughtful and intentional about how I describe them. So I never want to like be like plucking one of these stories from you know, the backup tapes live in an interview. So that's basically
So assuming
a
you have limited RAM that you could kind of jam with the stories that you want to use during the interviews, do you generally, and I'm sure that this advice probably varies based on like the person you're helping get ready for interviews, but
for
do you
sure.
generally try to coach people to get like a smaller number of like really rich, kind of like rich stories into their RAM? Or do you say like
Yeah,
the more the better, and even if they're like a little shallower, you'll have a story for each kind of like specific, you know, thing?
yeah. I mean, I think like I have a worksheet on this, and like I can share it later. But you know, for each of these four interview types, like I think having 2 to 4 stories in the hopper is good. And then like for me, just prepping myself, if I have 2 to 4 stories for each of these, and then I go through them like once, just writing them down, that's all I need.
Yeah.
I don't need anything more. Different people will prep differently and may need to like go through more verbosely and rehearse the stories. So it just kind of depends, but I think that's the continuum. But I think minimally have 2 to 4 stories, different and diverse stories for each one of these, and you'll be in good shape.
Yeah, and I think I agree with the cache size. I think if you have 50 or 60 stories, you're gonna you're gonna have a ranking problem at that point. And adding to Brian's point about understanding those stories, don't be too rigidly attached to the way that you explain a situation. So I sometimes think of it, particularly with clients who are visual thinkers. I say your story is a cube. You can rotate the cube so that a different face faces the interviewer. So, if an interviewer seems to want to understand a lot about how you work cross-functionally, talk more about that. Whereas if it's about how you support engineering teams, or they seem to want to care more about that. So don't be afraid to kind of adapt your story a little bit, and as I say, we're like rotate the cube, because the same story, that same launch, that same refactor, that same new integration or whatever it is you worked on, there's lots of ways to tell the story to demonstrate how you show up. So but definitely know what your stories are, try and make them rich, but you don't have to bring out every aspect of every story in answer to every question, because there isn't time. You're going to have to choose kind of where to focus.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah. Okay. So I'm kind of now okay. Actually, before that, and I forget, Robert, Brian, you guys have hard stops in 3 minutes?
I do not.
I don't think I do, but let me multitask and check.
Sure.
Okay. While we're doing that, I was just going to ask you guys if you have any other kind of like before we get into Q&A, any final kind of like tips for those listening on ways they could practice. We talked about lining up the stories. We talked about making sure you have stories that map to each of the dimensions we talk about, writing out and like, narrative form, maybe journaling on just like what happened, just to kind of get it all available, and like really making sure that the learnings from the stories are clear and top of mind. Any other specific like tips that you'd give people on how to like practice and get ready for this interview?
One is to actually work with someone else and ask them, do you see any other traits or interesting aspects of this story? Because I quite often, a client will share a story with me and I'll say, oh, this is also a really good fit for this kind of question. And I think often we can have a kind of a slightly narrow view of our own story. And if you share it with someone else, they're like, oh, hang on, that sounds like you had to do a lot of conflict resolution. Oh yeah, I guess I did. So either probably another PM or a coach or somebody, but they can give you that perspective, which might make your stories more versatile than you think. And that's definitely something that I see happen quite regularly. So yeah, work with another person, and it's not exactly a mock. It's more of a kind of, hey, what do you think about this story? Where could it be? How could I use it? How might I use it?
Any just like before we move on to Brian, any Robert, do you have any thoughts on people on how to like identify if it's not like a mock? Is it like, do you recommend it be with someone who's like worked at the company where they're interviewing, or like any qualifications or criteria?
Yeah, I think working at the company, that can be hard to find, but I think there are ways to do that. I think you're working on something like that, Ben, to help people get connected with someone who is at the company right now. That's definitely preferable. Ideally a calibrated interviewer, but yeah, somebody who's worked there, somebody who's working there now. Those are all good things. But I think someone who's been a PM for a while is better than nothing. So that would be where I would kind of put the bar, is like, someone who's been a PM and been a PM in a few different organizations. I would say that's kind of the minimum qualifications for that role.
Great. Yeah, Brian, any other tips or practice advice you'd give people beyond what's been said?
Yeah, I mean, I think STAR is not my favorite framework, but it's the framework I use for this. I think like trying to introspect or interrogate different frameworks and adapt them isn't gonna like get you a lot of mileage relative to the things that we're talking about, like having the set of stories in memory so they're ready to be deployed, being able to improvise and talk about them in a systematic way, in an authentic and genuine way, where they are talking about failure, but they're not talking about like incompetence. Hopefully nobody has examples of being incompetent, and like just trying to find that right balance, talk it out, talk it out loud. And I would also say that the same rigor, the same structure should apply to this in interviews, like in the abstract, that applies to product sense and analytical thinking. If you're using an internalizing star, you should get that, but it also helps at the beginning of these interviews, like to waypoint. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example about a time there was a conflict. Here's how I'm going to break that down, and like A, B, C, and D. Now I'm doing A, now I'm doing B, now I'm doing C, D, summarize, and just like all of those good like waypointing and communication skills and keeping your answers really down, sub 4 minutes. Target 3 minutes, because your interviewer will press in, your interviewer will prompt and provide feedback, like the example that Robert gave. So just really keeping them taut.
Yep. Great. Okay. So last thing before we jump into Q&A, I just wanted people to know where can they go if they have to drop and they just want to know more. Where can they learn what you guys are working on, or is there anything they can do to be helpful to you? Maybe I think Robert introduced himself first, so maybe Brian, I'll start with you if there's, and we'll include anything we plug in the email follow up. But like, what would you tell people?
Yeah, so like if you want to keep in touch, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm trying to kind of grow my audience and base. I share a lot of information there. One, and then two, I have a Substack, which is multiplier.pm. And my paid subscribers get access to my 14 product management interview guides and templates, which include product management, resume, and lots of resume advice and that sort of thing. So the paid portion of this conversation is over.
Appreciate that, Brian. I'll include links to that in the email. And Robert, where would you send people?
So my website has details in my coaching practice. It's accelerationcoach.com. As I mentioned at the start, I kind of have three aspects to my coaching. I have exec coaching, which is for people who are in a role, want to grow and thrive in that role. They're not necessarily looking to move right now. Then there's career guidance, helping people figure out what might be next, what could be next for them. And then what we've been talking about today, interview coaching, to really help people maximize their chances of success. So I coach across all of those three things. I do write. There's a writing section on my site. I'm not currently monetizing it. Brian, I'll talk to you about that. But super short articles, lots of perspectives on PMing and leadership. And yeah, if you want to ping me on LinkedIn and chat about anything, help figuring stuff out, then you can also find me there.
Great. On my end, I will plug my Maven course. So I teach a course for product sense and analytical thinking interviews. So basically, if you get to the point where you need the leadership and drive interview, you will have needed to first ace these two interviews, product sense and analytical thinking. Next cohort kicks off mid-October. So if your interviews are planned for, call it the beginning to middle of November, I think my course could probably end up being a good fit for you, or later. Some people like to get ready in advance. And if you use the promo code leadership for this lightning lesson, you'll get $200 off the price of the course. And you can email me with any questions about that. Okay. So with that said, I'm pulling up the questions, and maybe we'll do in the spirit of lightning lessons, we'll do a lightning round to get through these questions as fast as possible. Okay, so the first one is, if you're telling a story about conflict resolution, is a story where you resolve the conflict one-on-one more advisable to use than one where someone else had to get involved to help resolve the conflict?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. Great.
Are we lightning enough?
Yeah, that's great. Let's keep doing. Let's see. Any thoughts on how to prepare a story without knowing exactly what you'll be asked, and to not sound rehearsed, knowing it needs to sound organic and structured? So basically, how do you get the right stories prepared without, while coming off like not overly rehearsed?
I think bullet points rather than super detail, like have the key things down and know the points you probably want to hit in each answer. It's the old thing about know what you want to say, but not how you want to say it. And don't over rehearse. Sorry, obvious one.
So talking points over scripts.
Yeah.
Brian, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I think it's going to depend a little bit on the candidate's preparation style. Some people prefer scripts. I do. I do not. I prefer the method that Robert enumerated. Like, have the story top of mind, be able to like recall the salient details, and then point, smash my way through it.
Yep. There's a question here around, I said, you want to shoot for the moon with your stories. What I was just basically trying to say there, I don't want to take up too much time, is that basically like going the extra mile with the story to show the upgraded behavior and how you like paid it forward to someone else. Like you learned so much that you really like paid it forward to another person later. It just walks through that whole journey. So I think that's more what I was kind of saying, is like almost like punching through the story, like don't stop when you hit the target, kind of like follow through it is kind of another analogy that comes to mind for me. Any thoughts on how to respond to what are your weakness questions? And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. Obviously, like don't get into incompetence territory, but like, is there anything that strikes you as like good types of examples of weaknesses or attributes of weaknesses to talk about?
Yeah, I have like a little trick here that I sort of alluded to like before, which is like in my story where I acted as the user experience researcher. Like one, I'm kind of backhandedly saying in a positive way, like tooting my own horn a little bit, where I was like, hey, we didn't have UXR scrappiness. I did that, right? Then I'm saying, and I didn't engineer it this way, but I think it's something that you can reverse engineer and learn from, right? So it's like, hey, I'm like punching above my weight because I'm taking on this new thing. B, I'm not saying my weakness is I'm not a good communicator. I'm saying a subset, a very narrow subset, mind you, of my communication needed a tweak, basically needed a nip and a tuck, which is like, hey, my presentation could have been more structured. It could have had a better through line. It could have had a TLDR, like whatever it was, right? It's a genuine story. And so I'm saying that like there's this like sort of narrow point thing. So I'm not, I'm great at communicating in an ad hoc fashion. I'm great at like, a narrative fashion, but maybe just this like one thing, this PowerPoint or Google Slides thing needed improvement. But it was genuine and it was real. And I actually think there's a huge amount of value in doing this type of introspection. All of this work actually made me a better PM, and my stories are not BS stories. They're like legitimate stories. And I came to those stories by authentically introspecting on like my career stories as a PM. So this is going to like benefit you either way. It's like the hard thing is A, doing that introspection, and then B, outputting it in a way where you're not like completely sharing the, the harsher aspects of the introspection.
Yeah. And I think you can say things like, it doesn't come naturally to me to do this. So I have to make the effort. I have to step up. I'm not naturally like this. I need to be like that as a PM sometimes. And I'm aware of that deficiency, that bias, that tendency. And I work with it. It doesn't have to be, oh, I struggle to prioritize like that. That's, that's going to get you under the incompetence bar. Absolutely. But it's like in these situations, I sometimes have misstepped, and so I'm really aware of that, and I'm working on it. It's really about the fact that you are working on something, and the weakness question is something everybody should have thought about. It again, to Brian's point about if you're trying to come up with something on the fly, that is a terrible one. If you haven't thought about the superpower question, the weakness question, like those questions are several orders of magnitude easier if you've thought about them beforehand. They're very, very hard to do cold. And most people think, oh, yeah, I know what my superpower is. Like, can you answer it really well, though? Like, you've got to practice those topics, and the same with the weakness one.
Yeah. Same with the
Feedback
time you
is a
receive
gift.
difficult feedback and given difficult feedback. I was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Feedback is a gift, like, and you should embody receiving it as a gift. And for me, like, sometimes I can do that. Sometimes, like everybody else on the planet, my ego gets bruised, right? But do I have enough emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and wherewithal to take my emotions and my bruised little ego, put it aside, open up my ears, and like take that in, even if it's hard in the moment? And that's like, in a nutshell, what they're looking for. And you have to be able to embody it. It's hard to be able to embody it if you're not embodying it. It's hard to fake it.
Yeah. And I think for me, the like the perfect ending to a lot of those stories is how, well, went from like a very difficult to have conversation ended up making me like really close with someone. It was almost like it brought it strengthened the relationship, and like we ended up doing these things later that we would have never done if the relationship wasn't stronger or something like that. Okay. You both agree more recent stories are better than older stories, or do you think it's okay to use older stories that are less recent if they're just like the better stories?
Bias towards recency, but don't let a good story go just because it's from the past. So I would, it's narrow, but sometimes the best stories are from a few years ago. So it's a tough one, but
I have
that's what
a
I comment.
like cognitively hacking way of addressing this. So, everybody has probably heard of the cognitive bias, recency bias, right? Which is like, oh, like, Ben and I have been best friends for 30 years, but he was a jerk yesterday and I'm pissed off at him. And that's what I'm thinking about, right? So for your negative stories, I actually think it's better to have older stories. For your positive stories, I actually think it's better to have more recent ones. So like when you're demonstrating scrappiness or leading the team or helping resolve conflict, like if you can, you do not have to, if you can, choose the more positive ones as the more current and recent ones, and choose the older ones as the negative ones. And like, does that like change the game on an interview? Maybe, maybe not. But I think you're playing on human cognitive bias there, and that may work in your favor.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's really neat. Really neat.
That is really smart. I've never, Brian, I don't think you've ever shared that with me before. But that sounds almost like a cheat code that completely stays within the rules of the game, because my default bias when someone says that to me is, wow, they used to be this negative thing, but look how amazing they are now, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the obvious way your brain will interpret that, even though there's probably plenty of more recent examples of negative stories, but you're just choosing to not present them, which is a smart interview strategy. So, wow, yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's great. Okay, I think yeah, I think that's probably good for now. I know we're like 15 minutes over, so I want to be mindful of everyone's schedules. Folks who have other questions, Robert and Brian already mentioned how you can stay in touch and follow up with them. Thank you both for taking the time to do this, and thank you to everyone who took the time to listen to this. And for those of you who got locked out, I forgot to re-upgrade my Zoom plan when I got back from Europe. So only 100 people could join, but we maxed out 100. I didn't think more than 100 would come. To those of you who are watching the recording, sorry you couldn't join live, but hopefully you still got a lot of value out of this. All right. That's it. That's a wrap. Peace.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ben.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Brian.
Thanks so much.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.